been writing a bunch of drum and bass lately. There's something that really inspires me about really nice dry drum tones, high-pitched snares, but also this kind of hip-hop tape jungly sound. What I've done is I've grabbed MINDst Drums by Medallics, and I've had a bit of a dive in to see if I can get some of my natural playing articulations into something that I think sounds really cool for a drum and bass loop. Now, I know a lot of you aren't necessarily going to look at a keyboard when you're coming up with your drum parts and go, yeah, sure, let's just go. Not necessarily, right? But when it comes to programming, I want to show you exactly how to make these sounds happen and why some of this cool stuff happening under the hood is allowing for the drums to sound that much more human. So I've made this track here. This is without drums for now. I started off writing with a loop, but it didn't feel like it had the punch I was looking for, so I started making natural drums. But have a listen to what the backing sounds like. Now, I found this drum loop that started off that is cool, but it doesn't quite have the punch I was looking for. It feels a little static, a little thin. The thing I like about it so much is that it's got ghost notes that sound like ghost notes. This is where it gets really interesting with MINDst Drums, because ghost notes, for me, they're very important in how they tell a syncopated story with hi-hats. But there's not just one sound to a snare. And MINDst's the first plugin I found that really encompasses this. Let me show you. So inside MINDst Drums, in the snare, there are three zones, A, B, and C. A being central, B being kind of mid-central, mid-edge, and C being fully edge. And what I was really surprised to find was that in the mapping, when you go into snare mapping, you can actually choose the center zones A, B, and C, and the overtone zones A, B, and C. Let's dive into that for a second. So here is what an edge overtone snare sounds like. And now here's what a central center sounds like. Overtone, center. Do you hear how the overtone has so many more overtones, but also more top end? That's the edge, here's the center. It's more focused, it's not as long. So when I want to play a beat that has really cool ghost notes, I want to basically come up with something that just works nicely. So I've gone with a right hand leading hand because the pattern I want to play is on the drums. It's a really cool drum and bass beat that I've had in my head for a long time. The hands tap in 16th notes, but the right hand moves from the hi-hat to the snare. But we also focus on nice, powerful hits on the snare with that hand, and we just do ghost notes with that left hand. But that's what it sounds like when it's all on the center. But when we put that left hand on the edge, we get these different tones, these different sounds. Now that, coupled along with the snare's ability to switch from central hits to rim shots at a certain velocity point that's customizable, as well as the ability to do the same thing with the hats, going from tip to shank, the edge of the stick versus the tip of the stick. That, plus the ability to go alternate hands, listen to this, versus just single hand, which is how a lot of other plugins sound. It sounds unnatural, not like two sticks are being hit. That sounds great to me. So there's all sorts of ways you can play these 16th beat hats. So that's kind of like the vibe that loop was giving me, and it's really nice to just play around with it. I've had that kind of programmed, but if I'm to keyboard drum away a little bit more. So, I'll show you what's going on with these drums and why it gets programmed the way it is. So I've used this D1 note here. That is our edge of zone C. That's our overtone edge hit. Then E is the central hit. So here's what it sounds like with all the ghost notes still on that central zone A. I mean, it sounds great, but as a player, I might be choosing for the vibe to go more overtone-y within these hits and put them on this side zone C overtone hit. Have a listen to this. So what you should notice is that they're a lot more overtone-y and a lot less controlled. They're a little bit wilder, a little bit of a longer note. Compare the two here. This one will play with the central hits, and then this one will play with the edge hits. Now, there's quite a bit of compression and envelope shaping going on in this preset, and some overdrive, which is bringing out some of those characters. And that's something that I feel is really important, similar to with guitars when you're reamping. It's not ever going to sound quite the same as if you play into a sound. And I've been designing this sound alongside the programming, listening to these edge hits. Now, we've got the edge hit overtone C and B. So hopefully you can hear the difference between that. Overtone C, overtone B, central A. And then if you were to pull these up in volume, you'll hear there's a lot more power to that central hit, and this is one of the things we focus on with our technique a lot as drummers. When we look at fast snares as well, I think I'm hearing that there are actually double strokes and alternating hands happening here. That sounds really realistic to me. And again, this is zone C on the overtone, zone B on the overtone, and then zone A in the center. You can really hear the difference. So if I were to program in a little bit of triplet action here, so you can hear the difference. So this is zone C at the edge. Zone B at the edge. And zone A in the middle. You can really hear those shell overtones come through here. And that's that sound. With this particular shell, it's like a real overtone there that comes through. So that's why I really like things like this. They add to the realism when you have these fills. You might have noticed as well, you couldn't actually hear those ghost notes in the mix whatsoever. That's because they just weren't standing out enough. Here's it in the mix, and then maybe you'll be able to hear the difference. This is quite interesting. This is an accidental discovery in the middle of this. Here's the all centers, and then centers and edges. There's actually so much more top end on these ghosts. So that's why, as a player, I gravitate towards doing that, because it's just so much more lively and it sounds more like a hi-hat, which is cool because it's meant to just sound like syncopated, dancey percussion, right? Another thing that helps with the sound of hats in here is that we actually have a choice of hi-hat close mics, far and close. I really like the sound of far hi-hat mics. I don't like the sound of close hi-hat mics so much. Here we are at, let's say, -6 dB. I'm sure you can hear that. It's not even that loud on the mixer, but it's just very sharp, and it's a lot of frequencies I don't really like. Now, that was -6. If I bring this up to, say, -3, and just to show you what it sounds like with it muted, that's just the overhead air, right? Put it back in. If I were to do a 0 dB comparison, that's far, here's close. Ugh, I don't like it. I never liked it. So one of the things that makes drum and bass grooves sound so cool, it's something that Jojo Mayer has taught and developed, the way that drum sequences and loop breaking has been replayed. There's an element that you can kind of deconstruct what's going on digitally there and take cool funk beats, speed them up, which is where we get that higher snare from, and, you know, throw them through compressions and stuff and tape stuff. And I've emulated that by taking the preset Raw Funk 101, and then I've added some drive and compression to that on the master. This is what it sounds like without it. And I've also thrown some effects on the end, so I'll take all that off. It sounds really cool. I have reduced the volume on it because I'm doing volume boosting on the drive, so in the video I've gained that up to compensate. Here's with the drive. I love how natural and musical the drive is inside this very, very low 0.7 on this knob, and that's all it needs just to thicken it up, and also basically a half and half mix of, you know, driven versus undriven. And then the compression adds a lot of energy to that. It brings out some of the reflections from the studio reverb. As in here, you can hear how empty it sounds without it. And on. Just some of those reflections, and you can tell they're good quality reflections when you compress them and they sound sweet. I can push it to some extremes. At that point, it starts to sound over roomy, but at this point... And the rest of the sounds, apart from the articulation stuff, that's all just inside that preset. All I've added to that at the end is a nice preset called Oxford Envolution, which is a envelope shaper, but it allows you to focus in on certain frequency groups. Now, I haven't done that with this. I've just let it be broadband, transient, and sustain focus. But it has a really nice soft clipper, and what I've done is I've pushed a slightly cooler sounding kit into Envolution, and then that's just given me the ability to sweeten the transients and the sustains and kind of control those sounds more for a mix thing to make them really cut through without having to turn them up too loud. So here's what it sounds like bypassing just the kick and snare. So as you can see from the level here of the drum kit, it's kind of basically compressing it, limiting it, but it's doing so by throwing envelopes higher and lower, and that gives it this wonderful feeling of growth and excitement. And again, without anything, it just didn't sit in the mix. It was sitting under the mix. I was having to turn it up so loud and then let the limiters at the end stage clamp it down, and that was making everything else sound clamped and choked and just nasty. Even that much of a move, pushing it to +6, which is the end of where that goes. And then back on. This is just how the snare and the hats have been made to work so nicely with each other. I really recommend that you have a little bit of a play around with those different voicings and those different overtones with your ghost notes. Show us some examples in the Medallics Discord and basically just show us wherever you want. I wish you a lot of fun with your music making, and I wish you a great session ahead. Take care.